The night sky over the Pacific had fallen into a heavy silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Soldiers on distant islands stared upward, searching for meaning in the quiet, while officers in dimly lit rooms ran their fingers over maps that no longer promised hope. This was the night when Japan finally understood that the war it had once believed it could win had slipped beyond its grasp, and that defeat was no longer a distant possibility, but an inevitable truth. For years, the empire had expanded across oceans and continents, driven by confidence and the belief that destiny was on its side. The people were told that sacrifice would bring glory, and that discipline and unity would lead them to triumph. But now the cost had grown unbearable. Cities burned, supplies vanished, families waited in fear for news of loved ones who might never return. The empire that once felt unstoppable now felt fragile and exhausted. In military headquarters, the mood had changed from determined planning to quiet resignation. Generals who once spoke boldly now whispered as they reviewed reports of lost fleets, collapsing defenses, and supply chains stretched to breaking point. Communications from the front carried only grim news. American forces were closing in from every direction, and the skies that once belonged to Japanese aircraft now roared with enemy bombers that faced little resistance. On that night, the naval staff tried to revise strategies, but every path they traced on the map ended in the same conclusion. There were no more miracle offensives to attempt, no secret weapons to unveil, no reserves left to call upon. Even the most loyal officers could not ignore the truth. The Navy was shattered, the Air Force was nearly grounded, and the Army was worn thin from endless battles on distant shores. Far away from these rooms, soldiers in the field were feeling the shift as well. Many had sensed it long before their leaders acknowledged it. They read it in the faces of their comrades, in the ration shortages, in the failing equipment, and in the fear that no longer hid beneath their words. They had been told that surrender was worse than death, yet now even the fiercest among them wondered if any victory could still be found on the horizon. In Tokyo, civilians gathered around radios, waiting for updates that grew more alarming with each passing day. The air raids had become a constant reality. Firestorms swallowed neighborhoods, families fled from burning houses, clutching what little they had left in their arms. The government tried to maintain confidence, but the cracks were visible. Ministers argued, scientists warned that no technological breakthrough was coming. Diplomats pleaded for negotiation options that no longer existed. Meanwhile, deep inside the imperial palace, a different conversation unfolded. The emperor and his closest advisors were weighing the future of the nation. Their meetings had grown longer, filled with uneasy silence and unresolved questions. Many feared that continuing the war would only bring greater suffering to the people, while others believed surrender was unthinkable. The weight of centuries of tradition pressed heavily on every decision. As the night progressed, the news grew worse. A fleet that had been sent to intercept American forces had been obliterated before even approaching the enemy positions. Airfields that once launched fighter planes now held only wreckage and empty fuel drums. Messages from garrisons across the region reported overwhelming enemy advances. Soldiers were running out of ammunition, water, and even hope. Some officers wrote final letters to their families, knowing they would not survive the coming days. In the Navy headquarters, a senior admiral finally spoke words that had been avoided for months. He said the empire could no longer secure its borders, could no longer protect its citizens, and could no longer hope for a decisive victory. The room fell silent as the realization settled over them. Like a heavy shadow, they had known the truth, but hearing it aloud made it undeniable. Across the empire, people sensed the shift. Fishermen noticed fewer military ships on the coast. Farmers saw soldiers passing through villages with tired eyes and worn boots. Students heard their teachers speak more softly, as if chosen words might somehow ease the fear that filled every home. Everyone understood the war had taken everything: strength, resources, youth, and time, and there was nothing left to give. Inside military academies, instructors taught lessons with a somber tone, knowing that most of the young men before them would be sent into hopeless battles. Some of these students had grown up hearing that Japan was destined to rise above the world, But now they looked at each other with expressions of doubt and quiet sorrow. They no longer believed in victory, only in duty and survival. On the front lines, soldiers huddled together around small fires, whispering about their families and wondering if they would ever see home again. They spoke of peace, as if it were a distant dream too fragile to hope, for many had lost friends, comrades, and brothers in battles that now felt meaningless to them. The war that once inspired pride had become a vast, consuming darkness. Back in Tokyo, the night deepened, and the city lights flickered as power shortages grew worse. In a dimly lit office, a group of advisors studied new intelligence reports that confirmed the worst: the enemy was preparing an invasion. Force so large that no defense could stop it. The oceans no longer protected the islands. The air was no longer theirs. The empire stood alone with no allies left to support it. This was the night when even the most loyal officers admitted defeat in their hearts. Though they could not speak it aloud, they stared at the maps, remembering victories from years past, but those memories felt distant and hollow. The empire had stretched itself too thin, fought too many battles, ignored too many warnings, and now the consequences were closing in from all sides. As dawn approached, a pale light crept across the Pacific. The soldiers on distant islands watched the horizon with heavy hearts, knowing that another day of struggle was beginning. They had fought for so long, endured so much, and yet the end felt both inevitable and unreal. They wondered how their leaders would respond, wondered how much more suffering the nation would endure before a final decision was made. Inside the palace, the emperor sat quietly, listening to advisors argue about strategies that no longer mattered. He understood more than anyone the weight of the moment. He knew the people were suffering. He knew the military could not hold out much longer. He knew the world around Japan was closing fast, and that choices had grown dangerously limited. In cities across the islands, mothers held their children close, praying for safety. Fathers worked long hours repairing damaged roads and shelters, hoping to protect their families. Students were mobilized to dig trenches or carry supplies. Elderly citizens volunteered to help wherever they could. Despite their frailty, everyone felt the fear, but also a quiet resilience, the determination to endure even in the face of overwhelming despair. On this night, the truth settled over Japan like a thick fog. The war was lost. The empire that once dreamed of becoming an unshakable power now faced ruin. The people who had given everything were left with exhaustion and grief. The soldiers who had fought bravely saw that their sacrifices had reached their limit. The leaders who once spoke boldly now grasped the harsh reality that no strategy could change the outcome. Yet within this realization there was also a faint sense of clarity. For the first time in years, the question was not how to win, but how to save what remained, how to protect civilians, how to prevent complete destruction, how to find a path toward survival, even if that path was painful and humbling. By the time the sun rose across the empire, everyone from the highest commander to the youngest soldier had sensed the same truth. This was the turning point, the night when Japan finally understood that the war was no longer a battle for victory, but a struggle to preserve life itself, a moment that marked the beginning of the end. Long before the final surrender would be spoken into history, it was a night filled with silence, fear, and acceptance, a night when the empire faced itself and saw the limits of its power, a night when soldiers, civilians, leaders, and families all realized the same unspoken truth: the war was lost, and the only path forward was one that none of them had ever imagined, but one they would all have to face together.